The booming voice of the prosecutor echoed through the grand mahogany walls of the New York City courthouse, striking Ethan Crawford like a physical blow in front of the entire nation. The murmur of the packed gallery quickly morphed into a deafening roar of judgment and disdain. Journalists, curious onlookers, and prominent members of Manhattan high society all turned their heads in unison to glare at the man sitting in the defendant's chair. Camera flashes blinded the room, and venomous whispers sliced through the tense air like sharpened knives. A woman draped in glittering diamonds in the front row scoffed, muttering that he was a heartless monster who murdered old Arthur to seize his vast corporate empire. Ethan Crawford, 38 years old, the most coveted bachelor in the United States of America, who just a month prior graced magazine covers as a paragon of success, now sat with pale wrists, a loosened silk tie, and a vacant stare fixed on the cold marble floor. He kept his head bowed, not out of guilt, but because he knew no one in that massive room was willing to believe in his innocence. The judge, a stern man of 70 years, with a shock of white hair, struck his wooden gavel 3 times, demanding absolute order in his courtroom. The silence that followed fell heavy and abrupt, yet it was a silence thick with collective hatred and morbid anticipation. Everyone had gathered in the city to witness the spectacular downfall of the great Ethan Crawford, thirsting for his utter humiliation on a public stage. On giant screens installed outside the courthouse in the bustling streets of Manhattan, millions of people watched the live broadcast with bated breath. In local taverns, in suburban living rooms, and across busy coffee shops, the entire country shared one burning question. How could a privileged son poison his own father purely for financial gain? The prosecution seemed to possess an airtight case, leaving no room for reasonable doubt. The prosecuting attorney, a lean man with a razor-sharp voice, began his opening statement by detailing the tragic night of the 14th of March. He declared that Arthur Crawford, the legendary founder of the Crawford Empire, was discovered lifeless in his sprawling Long Island estate's study. The evidence presented was described as absolutely overwhelming and completely undeniable. The billionaire's last will and testament had been mysteriously altered a mere 3 days before the fatal incident. The prosecutor dramatically pointed out that the sole beneficiary of this sudden change was the accused sitting before them, his own son. A chilling shudder rippled through the audience as the lawyer paced the floor, exuding the arrogant confidence of a man already savoring a historic legal victory. He claimed to have irrefutable witnesses, solid financial documents, and a crystal-clear motive, arguing that Arthur had planned to disinherit his son due to massive debts and reckless behavior. Unable to bear the lies any longer, Ethan's voice finally broke as he leaped to his feet, shouting that it was a complete fabrication. He screamed that he loved his father deeply and would never have laid a hand on him to cause harm. 2 armed guards instantly grabbed his shoulders, forcing him back down as the judge threatened to have him expelled from the room. Ethan collapsed back into his wooden chair, his entire body trembling violently, and his eyes bloodshot from sleepless nights and endless weeping. He desperately scanned the sea of hostile faces, searching for just one sympathetic gaze, a single flicker of compassion in a room full of wolves. He found absolutely none among the wealthy elite, but hidden in the very back row, pressed against the oak paneling, someone was looking at him differently. Her name was Madison Vance, 28 years old, with fair skin, bright green eyes, and light brown hair pulled back into a simple, unassuming bun. She wore a crisp blue and white uniform, the standard attire for a domestic maid employed at the Crawford estate. Surrounded by designer coats and clouds of expensive French perfume, she looked like a small lost bird trapped inside a terrifying golden cage. Absolutely no one in the room noticed her presence, just as no one had truly noticed her existence for the past 3 years. She was the invisible girl who served the morning coffee, perfectly ironed the expensive shirts and quietly polished the silver while the masters discussed multi-million-dollar deals, treating her as if she were merely a piece of furniture. But furniture is always present, and Madison had seen and heard everything that transpired in the shadows of that house. Her hands hidden beneath the folds of her modest coat tightly gripped the handles of a worn brown leather purse resting on her lap. Inside that old bag, she concealed something incredibly dangerous, something that burned against her conscience like a hot coal, and possessed the power to completely overturn the trial or cost her very life. She whispered to herself in a voice so incredibly soft that the words vanished into the heavy air, that she had witnessed the entire truth and knew exactly who committed the crime. A single fearful tear rolled down her cheek, which she hastily wiped away anxiously, glancing left and right to ensure no one was observing her quiet breakdown. Just a few feet away from Madison's hidden corner sat Beatrice Lancaster Ethan's beautiful and fiercely ambitious fiancée, executing a flawless performance of a grieving widow. Dressed entirely in black designer mourning attire from head to toe, she wore a delicate sheer veil and clutched a silk handkerchief to dab at eyes that held no genuine tears. She wept for the news cameras, dramatically placing a hand over her heart, claiming her soul was shattered by the discovery that the man she intended to marry was a ruthless killer. The national media completely adored her, painting her as the tragic victim, the noble woman who had unwittingly fallen in love with a monster. But from her isolated vantage point, Madison watched the performance with ice in her veins, fully aware of the sickening reality. She knew with absolute certainty that hiding behind that elegant black veil and those carefully rehearsed tears was a venomous, calculating snake. Seated right next to the weeping Beatrice, looking perfectly immaculate in a tailored gray suit, with a smile that never quite reached his cold eyes, was Oliver Ridge. He was the trusted corporate lawyer and business partner of the Crawford family, the man who meticulously managed the banking accounts, the international contracts, and the darkest secrets. To the rest of the oblivious world, Oliver was simply a loyal friend, desperately seeking justice for his murdered mentor. But Madison stared at the snake and the wolf sitting side by side, feeling her lungs constrict because she had heard their sinister whispers. She remembered the night she carried a silver tray of hot tea up the grand staircase, pausing outside the heavy oak doors of the study to hear them plotting. Oliver had whispered that the old man signed the papers, and if they did not strike that very night, they would lose the entire fortune. Beatrice had coldly agreed, deciding they would kill him and ensure the perfect son carried the heavy burden of guilt. The horrific memory of the shattering porcelain cup from that night still haunted Madison's darkest nightmares, forcing her to realize she had to speak up, despite the terrifying power of the enemies she faced. 3 years before that chaotic trial in New York, Madison, Vance had walked through the towering wrought iron gates of the Crawford estate, carrying a cheap cardboard suitcase and a heart brimming with cautious hope. She had traveled from a small, economically depressed town where honest work was incredibly scarce and ambitious dreams slowly starved to death. Her beloved mother had fallen severely ill. The necessary medical treatments were outrageously expensive, and securing a position as a servant in the home of one of America's wealthiest families was her only viable lifeline. On her very first morning, the stern head housekeeper had firmly warned her that the masters of the house expected hard work and absolute silence. She was strictly instructed to perform her duties and vanish into the background, existing merely as a helpful ghost, drifting through the sprawling, opulent corridors. Madison obediently nodded and quickly mastered the demanding art of becoming entirely invisible to the wealthy inhabitants of the mansion. She scrubbed the massive marble entryways on her hands and knees long before the morning sun even kissed the horizon. She meticulously ironed delicate silk garments that carried price tags far exceeding her entire monthly wages. She elegantly served extravagant dinners to influential people who never once bothered to look her in the eye, snapping their manicured fingers for a glass of vintage wine as if summoning an obedient dog. The environment was profoundly cold and devoid of human warmth, a gilded fortress isolating the rich from the struggles of the working class. However, she soon discovered that there was exactly one person residing in that massive, intimidating home who possessed a genuinely different spirit. Arthur Crawford, the nearly 80-year-old patriarch who controlled a vast empire of luxury hotels, international banks, and real estate, possessed a gruff exterior, thick, intimidating eyebrows, and a voice that rumbled like distant thunder. Practically everyone on the vast estate was terrified of his notoriously short temper and his demanding expectations. Yet Madison intuitively sensed that heavily armored exterior protected an incredibly lonely and surprisingly tender heart. One rainy afternoon, as she carefully carried a steaming pot of herbal tea into his expansive book-lined study, the old billionaire surprisingly paused his work to ask her name. Madison was so utterly shocked by the simple human question that she nearly dropped the heavy silver tray onto the priceless Persian rug. No one in that enormous house had bothered to ask for her name in the entire 6 months she had been employed there. She nervously stammered her name, and Arthur repeated it slowly, a warm, genuine smile breaking through the deep wrinkles of his weathered face. He graciously invited her to sit down for just a few minutes, playfully complaining that his busy children and associates never had the time to keep a stubborn old man company. Madison smiled shyly, taking a seat at the edge of a leather chair, and in that quiet moment, a beautiful, secret friendship blossomed between the most powerful tycoon in the state and the humblest maid in his employ. Arthur began sharing captivating stories of his distant youth, vividly describing the days he started his empire by selling fresh bread from a rusty bicycle on the bustling streets of the city. He spoke with a trembling voice about his late wife, confessing the deep, lingering grief of missing her presence every single day. As their bond grew over the passing months, Arthur confided his deepest, most intimate worries to the quiet, attentive young woman. He told her late one evening that his son Ethan possessed a remarkably good heart, despite the public perception of him being just another spoiled, reckless, rich kid. The old man sorrowfully noted that Ethan was completely surrounded by greedy individuals who solely desired his immense wealth, not his friendship or love. Arthur specifically mentioned his deep mistrust of Beatrice, the glamorous fiancée, and furiously shook his head when discussing Oliver, his longtime lawyer. He admitted that for years he had blindly signed whatever complex legal documents were placed in front of him, but recently he had discovered glaring discrepancies in the offshore banking accounts that deeply troubled him. Madison listened to his confessions in complete silence, realizing that her own observations perfectly aligned with the old man's growing suspicions. While cleaning the upper floors, she had secretly watched Beatrice gleefully trying on the deceased Mrs. Crawford's priceless diamond necklaces when she assumed she was entirely alone. Madison had also overheard Beatrice whispering on her cell phone, viciously laughing and promising an unknown caller that the old man would soon be in the ground, and everything would belong to them. Furthermore, she had witnessed the supposedly loyal lawyer Oliver creeping into the private study at 2 o'clock in the morning and sneaking out with thick, confidential financial folders stuffed under his arm. But despite knowing these dark secrets, Madison felt utterly powerless, wondering who on earth would ever believe the wild accusations of a lowly maid against the city's elite. Sensing the rapidly approaching danger, Arthur called Madison into his study one crisp autumn afternoon and solemnly placed a thick, sealed yellow envelope into her trembling hands. He ordered her to hide it safely and absolutely never hand it over to anyone residing in the mansion, instructing her to only deliver it to the proper justice system if something terrible were to happen to him. Madison clutched the envelope to her chest, terrified by the dark implications of his words, begging him not to speak of death and insisting he would live for 100 years. The old billionaire offered a sad, resigned smile, stating that the hungry wolves could already smell his blood in the water. He expressed immense gratitude, calling her the only truly honest person left in his home, and the last genuine ally he had in a world corrupted by boundless greed. Madison's only other friend among the sprawling estate's staff was Clara, a plump, red-cheeked cook with a famously sharp tongue who had managed the massive kitchen for 30 years. Clara knew every hidden scandal and whispered rumor, often warning Madison while forcefully kneading bread dough that the mansion was cursed by toxic wealth. The cook firmly believed that the elderly master and her famous Sunday roasts were the only good things left in the house, referring to Beatrice as a venomous snake in high heels. Clara claimed to have seen Beatrice and Oliver whispering in dark corners, like scheming rats predicting they were plotting something genuinely wicked. When Madison innocently asked why nobody intervened to stop them, Clara let out a bitter, cynical laugh, stating that in a house ruled entirely by money, the absolute truth was worth far less than the dirty crumbs they swept off the kitchen floor. The devastating night of the 14th of March descended upon the sprawling Long Island estate with a bitter, biting wind that rattled the massive glass windows. Following their quiet, established routine, Arthur had politely requested his usual evening cup of warm chamomile tea to help him sleep. Madison meticulously prepared the silver serving tray, taking extra care to place the hot beverage into the billionaire's absolute favorite delicate porcelain cup. She quietly ascended the grand, sweeping mahogany staircase, the thick carpet muffling her footsteps as she approached the dimly lit corridor leading to the master study. As she drew near the heavy wooden doors, she suddenly stopped dead in her tracks, her heart skipping a painful beat. The door was slightly ajar, and a sliver of yellow light spilled into the hallway, carrying the unmistakable tense whispers of voices that had absolutely no business being there at that late hour. Pressing herself against the cold wall, Madison peered through the narrow crack and immediately recognized the distinct silhouettes of Beatrice and Oliver standing near the desk. Oliver's voice was tight with rising panic, as he aggressively whispered that the old man had already signed the devastating changes to his last will and testament. The lawyer explained that the documents would be officially notarized the very next morning, leaving their greedy hands completely empty because Arthur had decided to donate his entire fortune to a charitable foundation. Beatrice responded with a terrifying icy calmness that made the blood freeze in Madison's veins, declaring that they simply could not allow tomorrow to arrive. The glamorous fiancé coldly finalized the sinister plot, insisting they had to murder him that very night, and ensure the overwhelming blame fell squarely onto the shoulders of the perfect, oblivious son. Oliver hesitated for a brief, cowardly moment, nervously pointing out that the domestic staff, specifically the young maid who always brought the evening tea, might spot them in the hallway. Beatrice scoffed, with vicious, unmasked disdain, labeling Madison a starving nobody who was entirely invisible and completely irrelevant to their grand designs. She arrogantly argued that even if the pathetic servant witnessed the entire crime, absolutely no judge or jury in the country would ever believe the frantic word of a poor maid over their combined wealth and established power. Hearing those cruel, dismissive words, Madison's knees violently buckled beneath her, a wave of sheer terror washing over her shaking body. Her grip on the polished silver tray faltered, and the delicate porcelain teacup suddenly slid off the edge, plunging toward the unforgiving marble floor. The cup shattered into 100 jagged pieces with a sharp, explosive crash that echoed through the silent corridor like a deafening gunshot. The two dark silhouettes inside the study instantly whipped around toward the door, and Oliver angrily shouted into the darkness, demanding to know who was lurking out there. But Madison was already sprinting wildly down the long, unlit hallway, her pulse hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird desperately trying to escape a cage. Hot, Blinding tears streamed down her panicked face as she ran as fast as her legs could carry, her absolutely terrified to look back over her shoulder. She burst into her tiny, cramped servants' quarters, slamming the door shut and locking it tight, collapsing onto the floor, where she hugged her knees in the pitch black, desperately praying they had not seen her face. The very next morning, the grand estate awoke to absolute chaos, blood-curdling screams, and the flashing red and blue lights of local police cruisers. Arthur Crawford was discovered dead. In his opulent study, his lifeless body slumped awkwardly over his massive desk, alongside a suspiciously spilled cup of tea. The medical examiners quickly determined the cause of death to be a highly potent, fast-acting poison slipped into his evening beverage. Before Madison could even fully process the horrific reality of losing her only friend, aggressive news reporters had already swarmed the wrought iron gates. The detectives had a perfect, neatly packaged suspect handed to them on a silver platter: Ethan Crawford, the wealthy heir, the only person who supposedly stood to gain everything based on a forged original will that Oliver smoothly presented to the authorities. Madison watched through a gap in the heavy velvet curtains as police officers forcefully shoved Ethan into the back of a squad car, his hands bound in heavy steel cuffs, while he desperately screamed his innocence. Beatrice put on a masterful, sickening performance for the flashing cameras, collapsing in theatrical, heartbroken sobs, while Oliver stood beside her, shaking his head in feigned, profound sorrow. The young maid's heart shattered into a million pieces, witnessing the destruction of an innocent man's life, while the true monsters basked in the sympathy of the public. She whispered a frantic prayer into the empty room, realizing with crushing dread that she was the absolute only person in the world who held the terrifying truth. Late that same night, under the cover of suffocating darkness, Madison silently crept back into the deceased patriarch's study, determined to find the one item Arthur had once mentioned to her. She desperately searched through his hidden desk compartments until her trembling fingers brushed against a small metallic voice recorder he secretly used to dictate his private memoirs. Arthur had confided in her that he sometimes left it running to gather concrete evidence, just in case the wolves ever decided to aggressively attack his legacy. With her hands shaking violently, she pressed the play button and listened in horrified silence as the miniature device perfectly played back the chilling voices of Beatrice and Oliver, orchestrating the cold-blooded murder. The brilliant, cynical old man had left the machine recording as his final cunning act of defiance against the traitors in his home. Madison clutched the small recorder tightly to her chest, holding it together with the thick yellow envelope Arthur had previously entrusted to her care. She now possessed the ultimate weapon, an undeniable cache of evidence, capable of exonerating an innocent man and sending two ruthless killers to a federal prison. However, she also painfully realized she was holding her own signed death warrant, because if those two powerful individuals ever discovered what she possessed, they would eliminate her without a second thought. Just as a cold shiver ran down her spine, the kitchen cook, Clara, suddenly appeared in the doorway, her usually cheerful face drawn pale and deadly serious. The older woman warned Madison that in a house built on such dark secrets, people who knew too much always ended up sharing the exact same tragic fate as the murdered master. The air inside the New York City holding cell was thick, smelling strongly of damp concrete, rusted iron bars, and absolute human despair. Ethan Crawford, the man who just weeks prior had slept on imported silk sheets and dined in exclusive five-star restaurants, now sat slumped on a rigid metal cot. He buried his exhausted face in his hands, listening to the agonizing rhythmic dripping of a broken water pipe echoing in the oppressive darkness. A burly guard forcefully rattled the iron bars, aggressively barking that the prisoner had a visitor, sparking a tiny, desperate flicker of hope in Ethan's chest. He foolishly thought a loyal friend or a dedicated business partner had finally come to tell him they believed in his innocence. Instead, The man who confidently strolled into the miserable cell was Oliver Ridge, dressed impeccably in a tailored gray suit, smelling of expensive cologne and profound betrayal. Oliver offered a sickeningly sympathetic smile that completely failed to reach his calculating eyes, hypocritically stating how deeply it pained him to see his old friend locked in a cage. Ethan leaped up from the cot with a profound sense of relief, desperately pleading with the lawyer to find a legal loophole to get him out, swearing he would never harm his own flesh and blood. The lawyer smoothly agreed, placing an expensive leather briefcase onto the small scratched metallic table, claiming he had come specifically to help secure his freedom. Oliver slowly opened the case, withdrawing a thick stack of complex legal documents, and smoothly slid them across the table, urging Ethan to sign them immediately. He explained it was a temporary power of attorney, arguing that someone capable needed to aggressively manage the massive corporate empire, the international banks, and the real estate, while Ethan remained tragically indisposed. Ethan picked up the heavy stack of papers, his tired eyes scanning the dense legal jargon, and slowly his expression morphed from desperate hope to hardening rage. He realized instantly that the documents were not temporary measures, but a permanent surrender of his absolute control over his late father's immense multi-billion-dollar fortune. If he signed his name on those dotted lines, Oliver and Beatrice would officially steal the entire empire forever, leaving him completely powerless and legally destitute. The lawyer's fake smile dropped several degrees into a chilling smirk as Ethan fiercely accused him of being the mastermind behind the assassination of his father. Ethan aggressively crumpled the legal papers in his fists and hurled them onto the filthy floor, shouting that he finally understood the deep, sickening depths of their betrayal. Oliver stood perfectly still for a terrifying moment, his face a mask of absolute chilling calm, before he leaned across the small metal table to whisper a devastating reality. He coldly informed the ruined billionaire that he was completely and utterly alone. The aggressive media had already convicted him in the court of public opinion. He revealed that the judges had already been heavily compensated, and any potential witnesses who might have helped the defense had conveniently changed their stories or disappeared entirely. The lawyer promised Ethan that he would spend the rest of his miserable life rotting inside a damp cell, unless he accepted the inevitable defeat and signed the wealth away. Oliver picked up his leather briefcase, smugly declaring himself an ultimate survivor, who always won, leaving Ethan completely shattered and isolated in the suffocating darkness of the prison. Meanwhile, back at the luxurious Long Island estate, Beatrice Lancaster was throwing a private, twisted celebration, having forcefully moved her belongings into the Grand Master Suite. She shamelessly slept in Arthur's massive bed, brazenly occupied his private study, and aggressively barked orders at the terrified domestic staff as if she were the absolute queen of the castle. Pacing the floor with a large glass of expensive red wine in her manicured hand, she demanded the servants immediately tear down the heavy curtains and remove every portrait of the deceased old man, because his lingering stare gave her annoying chills. Clara the cook, passing through the hall with a silver tray, bit her lip so hard it nearly bled to stop herself from screaming at the wicked woman. Madison, walking quietly beside the older woman, kept her eyes glued respectfully to the floor, desperately trying to remain completely invisible. Suddenly, Beatrice snapped her perfectly manicured fingers aggressively, pointing straight at Madison and demanding the young maid step closer to the center of the room. Madison slowly approached her heart, hammering against her ribs like a runaway freight train, politely murmuring a soft, subservient response. The glamorous villainess slowly looked the maid up and down with the predatory, calculating gaze of a hungry snake studying a cornered mouse. Beatrice hummed thoughtfully, taking a slow sip of her red wine, and noted aloud that she recognized the girl's face, asking if she was the type of servant who had a habit of wandering the halls and seeing entirely too much late at night. Madison felt the blood completely drain from her face, but miraculously maintained a steady voice, softly replying that she only ever noticed the dust she was hired to vigorously scrub away. Beatrice stared at her in deafening silence for a long, agonizing minute before a slow, wicked, and completely terrifying smile spread across her perfectly painted lips. She leaned down her voice, dropping to a dangerous, icy whisper, warning the young woman that, in this particular house, things that see too much always end up violently broken. She specifically mentioned the incredibly clumsy, unfortunate person who had dropped and shattered the expensive porcelain teacup right outside the study on the exact night the billionaire unexpectedly died. Madison felt as if the heavy ceiling had suddenly collapsed upon her shoulders, instantly realizing that the murderers strongly suspected she was the unseen witness in the dark hallway. She quickly excused herself respectfully, bowing her head, and practically fled the room before her shaking legs gave out completely. In the safety of the busy kitchen, Clara found the young maid leaning heavily against the tiled wall, her face as white as a fresh sheet of paper, and her breathing shallow. Madison frantically whispered that Beatrice absolutely knew she was the one who broke the cup, and that the vicious woman was actively hunting her down. Clara dropped her heavy wooden spoon, making the sign of the cross, and urgently warned the girl that the ruthless woman would never show mercy to anyone who threatened her stolen fortune. Later that terrible night, Madison returned to her small quarters only to discover her bed awkwardly, tilted her drawers yanked open, and her meager belongings completely ransacked by an unknown intruder. She found a terrifying note left squarely on her pillow, assembled from jagged magazine clippings, explicitly warning her to keep her mouth permanently shut if she wished to remain alive. With only 2 days remaining before the highly publicized trial reached its final verdict, the suffocating tension inside the grand Long Island mansion was absolutely unbearable. Madison had barely slept a single hour, jumping at every creaking floorboard, thoroughly convinced an assassin was lurking in the cold shadows of the expansive corridors. The terrifying ransom-style note demanding her absolute silence remained brutally seared into her anxious mind, a constant reminder of the incredible danger surrounding her every move. Yet despite the paralyzing fear gripping her heart, she had made the resolute decision not to remain silent, a choice that in this corrupted house was effectively a signed death warrant. That morning, while nervously mopping the polished floors of the grand ballroom, she heard heavy footsteps approaching and felt her blood run instantly cold. It was Oliver Ridge advancing toward her with that predatory shark-like smile that always made her stomach violently churn in deep disgust. He casually stopped in front of her, smoothly greeting her by name and slipping his hands deeply into the pockets of his expensive tailored trousers. The lawyer spoke in a dangerously soft, patronizing tone, suggesting that a discreet, hard-working young woman like her deserved a much better life than scrubbing floors for a meager wage. He slowly pulled a remarkably thick stack of crisp $100 bills from his jacket, casually tossing the massive bribe onto the nearest polished wooden table. He explicitly promised her that the money was more than she could possibly earn in 5 years of back-breaking labor, demanding only one tiny favor in return: she must immediately disappear back to her dusty hometown and never return. Madison stared at the overwhelming pile of cash, acutely aware that it represented an absolute fortune capable of buying her mother's expensive medicines for years to come. With that incredible sum, she could easily purchase a comfortable small house, completely start her life over, and run far away from the horrific nightmare consuming the Crawford estate. For a brief, agonizing second, the desperate temptation flickered in her tired eyes, a hesitation the highly observant lawyer immediately noticed and attempted to ruthlessly exploit. He smoothly urged her to be an intelligent woman, arguing that she owed absolutely nothing to the wealthy Crawford family, and should simply take the money, be happy, and conveniently forget whatever she foolishly believed she had witnessed. But as she looked up, the warm, trusting voice of Arthur echoed loudly in her mind, completely shattering the illusion of the bribe. She violently shoved the massive stack of cash back across the table, her voice shaking violently, but her core resolve made of absolute unbreakable steel. She bravely looked the powerful lawyer dead in the eye, declaring that she was absolutely not for sale to anyone, especially not to a cold-blooded murderer. Oliver's charming, sophisticated mask instantly evaporated his handsome face, twisting into a cold, cruel, and incredibly dangerous sneer of pure malice. He leaned in so uncomfortably close that she could smell the mint on his breath, whispering that she was making a fatal mistake that she would not live long enough to regret. He explicitly threatened that many people had permanently disappeared for knowing far less than she did, promising that her foolish bravery would only lead to a tragic, untimely accident before she ever reached the courthouse. Desperate for an ally, Madison secretly took a long bus ride into the bustling heart of New York City to seek out the only person she thought might listen. She had secretly read a controversial article written by an independent journalist named Robert, the only reporter in the entire city brave enough to publicly question Ethan's supposed guilt. With her heart practically beating out of her chest, she marched into the chaotic, loud newspaper office and frantically begged for a private moment with the skeptical, gray-haired man. She breathlessly revealed her identity as a maid from the Crawford estate, swearing she possessed explosive information proving Ethan's innocence and detailing the true murderer's sinister midnight plot. Robert listened intently, but heavily sighed, rubbing his temples as he explained that dozens of crazy people walked into his office every week claiming to hold the secret truth to famous cases. He explicitly demanded hard physical evidence, stating that without concrete documents or audio, the billionaire lawyers would ruthlessly sue him into absolute bankruptcy. Madison admitted she had a secret tape recording and a written letter from Arthur himself, but she had hidden them safely away, too terrified of being violently mugged to carry them through the city. Robert sympathetically shook his head, advising her to return only when she held the physical proof in her hands, strongly warning her that she was dangerously playing with fire. Madison left the noisy building feeling utterly crushed, painfully realizing that a poor, uneducated servant without physical evidence was considered absolutely nobody by the rest of the world. Walking down a narrow, relatively empty street toward the bus terminal, the exact nightmare she feared violently exploded into a terrifying reality. A sleek black sedan aggressively screeched to a halt right beside her, the heavy doors flying open to reveal two massive, intimidating men with scarred, brutal faces. One of the thugs viciously grabbed her slender arm, violently attempting to drag her screaming and kicking toward the dark interior of the idling vehicle. Madison fought back with the feral desperation of a cornered wildcat, violently scratching his face, kicking his shins, and swinging her heavy leather purse directly into the second man's nose. The sudden, painful impact caused the attacker to momentarily stumble backward, granting Madison the precious split-second advantage she desperately needed to break entirely free from their grasp. She sprinted down the concrete sidewalk like a bullet, darting frantically through a crowded outdoor market, her lungs burning like fire, while the heavy footsteps of her pursuers pounded right behind her. Just as Madison's strength was fading, an elderly pretzel vendor accidentally blocked the pursuing thugs with her cart and secretly hid the frightened maid beneath flour sacks inside her kiosk until the danger passed. That night, Madison reached Clara's apartment and opened Arthur's hidden envelope, discovering financial records exposing the embezzlement along with a heartfelt letter proving Ethan's innocence. The next day, as the court prepared to deliver its final verdict against Ethan, Madison burst into the packed courtroom carrying a cassette recorder and crucial documents. Despite attempts to stop her, she boldly declared Ethan innocent and played a recording in which Oliver and Beatrice discussed Arthur's murder and their plan to frame Ethan. Arthur's letter and the authentic will confirmed Ethan's innocence, exposed the conspiracy, and revealed that his fortune had been divided equally among Ethan Charity and Madison in recognition of her kindness. The revelations shattered Beatrice and Oliver's scheme. In a desperate outburst, Beatrice effectively confessed before being arrested alongside Oliver for murder fraud and conspiracy, while Ethan was finally freed from his handcuffs and publicly thanked Madison for saving his life. Months later, the two married in a simple ceremony, surrounded by true friends, their bond forged through courage and honesty. Their story proves that genuine wealth lies not in money, but in integrity, compassion, and the willingness to stand for justice. Even when greed and deception seem powerful, selfless bravery and unwavering truth can expose evil, protect the innocent, and leave behind a legacy of love, loyalty, and honor that endures far beyond material success.